Welcome back to Reddit Echoes. Today's stories come from the part of Reddit where people push too far, say the wrong thing, or judge the wrong person, and then immediately regret it. These are the moments when patience runs out, politeness disappears, and the truth hits a little harder than expected. So grab a seat, because these are the stories where people truly fool around and find out. Story 1. He asked to speak to the man of the house, so I introduced him to my dead husband. I'd been widowed for about 2 years when this happened. I still missed my husband every single day, so I kept his urn on my bedside table. I talked to him about my day, complained about little things, and said goodnight to him before I went to sleep. It helped. It made the house feel less empty. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. I'm socially anxious, so my first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. I ignored it. Then it rang again, and again, and again. By the fourth ring, my anxiety had turned into pure irritation, so I finally opened the door. There was a man standing there with a clipboard, immediately launching into a rehearsed speech about the state of my gutters and how they were apparently in desperate need of cleaning. And wouldn't you know it, he just so happened to be the guy willing to do the dirty work for only $250. I tried to politely decline. I told him I wasn't interested. He didn't even pause. Instead, he smiled and said he really needed to speak to the man of the house. That sentence flipped a switch in my brain. I leaned back into the house and called out, "Mark!" I shouted that there was a guy at the door who wanted to talk about cleaning the gutters. Of course, there was no response. I called his name again, louder this time. Still nothing. I turned back to the salesman and apologized, saying I'd just run upstairs and grab my husband. And I did. I ran upstairs, walked into my bedroom, and picked up Mark's urn. When I came back to the front door, I started complaining out loud to Mark about how frustrating it was when he ignored me, how much I hated when he gave me the silent treatment. Then I held up the urn like I was presenting a prize on a game show and said, "Here he is, the man of the house." I continued talking, still to Mark, about how he's such a good listener, but how disappointed I am that he's so uninvolved with the kids. I said he's always been the strong, silent type. By this point, the salesman hadn't said a word. His eyes were wide. His mouth was slightly open. I decided to fully commit. I started crying. Real crying. I hate crying in front of strangers, but the grief I'd been holding in for 2 years, mixed with the absolute rage I felt at this man's arrogance and casual sexism, just spilled out of me. I sobbed about how much I hated my life now, about losing the father of my children, about how unfair it all was. It wasn't cute crying either. It was full-on ugly crying. Snot, gasping, shaking. I didn't even notice when he took off. Apparently, at some point during my meltdown, he decided he'd had enough of the hysterical widow holding an urn and sprinted back to his truck. Honestly, it felt amazing. It was cathartic in a way I didn't even realize I needed. Sometimes I still laugh about it with Mark. I know for a fact he would have been howling with laughter. He always did love a good joke. And I have a feeling that salesman never asked to speak to the man of the house again.
Story 2. My dad bragged about raising insecure kids, so I told him what that really led to. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and this happened while I was visiting my father from out of state. We were all sitting around the dinner table, my dad, his wife, a few relatives, just talking. My parents divorced when I was about 13 or 14. They both remarried, but my dad has never let the divorce go. Even now, decades later, he still finds ways to trash my mom whenever he can. Lately, he's also developed this really disturbing sense of pride about how he raised us. He actually brags about it. He says kids need to be raised insecure because in his mind, insecurity is the only way people learn to think about others. According to him, you guilt kids early so they learn to guilt themselves later. He talks about it like it's some kind of parenting hack. So while he's going on about how successful he was at making us insecure, I finally said it out loud. I told him, except all that really did was turn me into a doormat. The table went quiet. I explained that I spent most of my teenage years desperate for approval. I let people walk all over me. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I did things I wasn't comfortable with just because I wanted someone to like me. My dad didn't reflect. He didn't apologize. Instead, he saw an opening. He smirked and said, "Yeah, your brother told me you used to sneak boys into your mom's house at night. That never would have happened if I'd gotten sole custody instead of her." That's when something in me snapped. I looked straight at him and said, "Actually, it probably would have happened a lot more." His smile faded. I continued calmly. "In fact, the very first time it happened was here, in your house." The shock on his face was immediate and honestly, kind of impressive. He stammered and asked what I meant, so I told him. I said I used to take my bedroom window screen out and have them climb in through the window. His jaw literally dropped. I could see him trying to process it. Then I delivered the part that broke him. I said, "Oh, and by the way, I was 15 the first time. He was 20, a man, not a boy." I told him that's what happens when you raise a kid so insecure that they'll do anything for approval. That was it. I have never seen my father back out of a conversation so fast in my life. His brain just shut down. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself, he didn't even get angry. He just changed the subject like none of it had happened. And honestly, that stood out more than any response ever could have. If you asked him about that conversation today, I'm almost certain he's wiped it from his memory. It doesn't fit into the version of himself he likes to believe in. His mind simply can't hold it. He still brags about raising insecure kids, but I don't need him to stop, because every time he does, all I can see is the look on his face in that moment, when he finally understood exactly what his parenting philosophy had cost me. And that's enough for me. Story 3. She said we didn't need the wheelchair, so I told her the truth. This happened back when I was in high school. My friend group included this one guy who was terminally ill. At the time, even his doctors were surprised he was still alive. Aside from being very skinny and a little pale, he looked like a completely normal teenager. On his good days, he tried really hard to just be one of us. He talked about college, about his future career, about all the things he wanted to do, like he had all the time in the world. We never brought up his illness. That was his rule. He wanted to be treated like everyone else, so we respected that. He had a disability placard, which meant we parked in handicapped spots. And yeah, we got a lot of dirty looks when a group of seemingly healthy teenagers got out of the car, but our friend ignored it, so we did too. Until one weekend in an amusement park. After about an hour, he started getting tired, so we got him one of those loaner wheelchairs. Being teenagers, we probably weren't as dignified as we should have been. We took turns pushing him a little too fast and popping wheelies, but we were careful not to bother anyone else. He was laughing harder than I'd seen him laugh in a long time. And then she appeared. This woman, standing maybe 30 feet away, shouted at us, asking if we realized we were keeping that wheelchair from someone who actually needed it. I looked over at my friend. His smile vanished instantly, and that was it for me. I was done, completely done. I walked over to her, already knowing exactly what I was going to say. I kept my voice low so my friend wouldn't hear me. I said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm sure you'll be relieved to know that my friend has a terminal illness and his doctors say he could die at any moment, so someone else will be able to use the wheelchair very soon." Her face went bright red. She stammered and said, "Well, how was I supposed to know that?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You weren't, because it's none of your business." Then I added, "So thank you for reminding my friend that he's dying, right when he was finally having fun." I turned around and walked back to my friends. He made it another 2 years after that. Jay, if somehow you're listening, I still miss you, man.
Story 4. She touched my stomach and asked when I was due, so I let her panic. This happened when I was about 16 years old. I've always struggled with severe endometriosis. One of the worst side effects is the bloating. It gets so bad that I look very, very pregnant. Even years later and after 2 surgeries, people still comment on it. Back then, I was about 5'6" and barely 100 pounds. I basically looked like a pole with a huge bump sticking out. At the time, I lived with my parents in a small conservative beach town in Florida. Lots of older people, lots of judgment. One day, I was walking around Walmart, minding my own business, looking for maternity pants because the bloating had gotten that bad. That's when a woman in her 50s walked up to me.
Without asking, she placed her hand directly on my stomach and smiled brightly. She said, "Oh my God, when are you due? You look amazing. You're so young." I just froze. I'd been asked that question before, but no one had ever touched me like that. I stood there for a second, completely stunned. Then I smiled back and said, "I'm not sure. I'm only 12. My mom knows all that stuff about pregnancy." The color drained from her face instantly. She took 3 steps back, let out this nervous little laugh, and didn't say another word. I just stood there, smiling, still holding my stomach, watching her realize exactly what she'd just done. She mumbled something under her breath and walked away as fast as she could. And honestly, I hope she never touched a stranger's stomach again. Story 5. He told me to smile 4 hours after my mom died. This happened on one of the worst days of my life. My mom had been terminally ill and in hospice care at our home. We all knew the end was coming, but knowing that doesn't make it easier. When I'm upset, the first thing that completely falls apart is my sleep schedule. For weeks, I'd barely been sleeping at all. That night, I think I slept maybe 2 hours. My mom passed away a little before 4 in the morning. After everything settled and the house went quiet, I realized I was running purely on fumes. I knew I needed caffeine just to function, so when the nearest gas station opened around 8, I drove over to grab some energy drinks. I probably looked like a disaster. I was exhausted, puffy from crying, and wearing oversized college merch that definitely didn't help. I parked, got out of my car, and started digging through my pockets, trying to remember which massive pocket I'd shoved my wallet into. That's when a man pulled up to a pump about 20 feet away. He had a really shiny car and this overly polished look, like a game show host or someone who was way too pleased with himself. He glanced over at me and said loudly, "It's a shame someone so pretty can't improve everyone's day with a smile." And that was it. I just broke. I went from standing there half asleep to completely losing it, full-on ugly crying, sobbing, shaking, gasping for air in the middle of a mostly empty parking lot. Somewhere through the tears, I managed to yell, "I'm sorry I'm not fucking pretty enough for you when my mom died 4 hours ago." The look on his face lasted about half a second. Then he turned around, got back into his car, and left. He didn't pump gas, he didn't go inside for coffee, he didn't apologize. He just drove away. And honestly, I hope that comment haunts him every time he thinks about telling a stranger to smile.
Story 6. He called me a slur in line, so I thanked him. I'm a straight guy in my 20s, living in a part of Florida that's basically a retirement hotspot. Even by Florida standards, this area is packed with older people who are openly racist, homophobic, and sexist, and they don't feel the need to hide it. I work at a local library, so dealing with people like that is unfortunately part of my daily routine. At work, I usually have to bite my tongue unless someone crosses a very clear line. But this didn't happen at work. This happened one morning at a grocery store before my commute. I was standing in line, minding my own business, when I heard a voice behind me say, "Take that metal out of your ears, boy. You look like a homo." I turned around and saw this old guy who probably should have retired from being rude decades ago. I get comments like that all the time because of how I dress. I wear earrings, lots of them, and necklaces, bracelets, rings. I've been told I look like a punk rocker on a permanent Hawaiian vacation. Most days I ignore it. That day, I didn't feel like letting it slide. I smiled at him and said, "Thank you. My boyfriends love it. They think I'm really cute." He didn't say a word. He didn't insult me again or try to laugh it off. He just stood there with his mouth hanging open, staring at me like his brain had completely short-circuited. I gave him one last smile and turned back around. He stayed silent for the rest of the line. When I got up to the cashier, she smiled at me and said, "You do look really cute." I didn't even bother turning around to see his reaction. I didn't need to. Story 7. She accused me of being a predator, so I told her about my daughter. I'm a 28-year-old woman and I grew up working class. For a lot of my childhood, my family lived below the poverty line. My parents always did everything they could to make sure my brother and I had what we needed, even when it meant sacrificing things for themselves. They both love Disney movies, like really love them. So my brother Eric and I made it a goal to take them on a Disney cruise as a thank you for everything they'd done for us.
We paid for it ourselves and surprised them with the trip. There were 5 of us total on that cruise: my parents, me, my wife, and my brother Eric. We're child-free by choice. Eric, on the other hand, lost his daughter to SIDS 2 years earlier. Eric is bisexual. He paints his nails, has what people like to call a gay voice, and he doesn't exactly blend into the background. He's also one of the gentlest people I know. That matters, because the woman in the cabin next to his noticed him. One day, she saw Eric walking back to his room alone while she was herding her kids into their cabin. She stopped him, blocked his path, and demanded to know what he was doing there. Eric told her he was on vacation with his parents. That wasn't good enough for her. She accused him of being there to perv on her young son. She said there was no reason for someone like him to be on a Disney cruise if he didn't have children. Eric tried to stay calm. He told her he was there with his family and that he would never look at a child that way. She started shouting. She said he was obviously perverted and shouldn't be allowed on the ship. That's when Eric finally snapped. He raised his voice and said, "I would have brought my daughter, but the church was reluctant to exhume her coffin for a Disney trip." The hallway went dead silent. The woman just stared at him. For a moment, it looked like her brain couldn't quite process what she'd just heard. Then she huffed, grabbed her kids, and retreated into her cabin without another word. Eric stood there shaking afterward, but he never cried. He just let out this long breath like he'd been holding it in for years. She never spoke to him again for the rest of the cruise. And honestly, I hope she thinks about that moment every time she decides to judge someone she knows absolutely nothing about.
Story 8. She insulted me on a plane, so I treated her like a crying child. I've got fairly broad shoulders, and on this flight I was stuck in the middle seat in economy. It was a completely full flight from New Orleans to Atlanta, about an hour and a half total. Not long, but long enough to be uncomfortable if you're already cramped. About 5 minutes after takeoff, the woman in the aisle seat next to me started acting restless. She kept squirming, sighing loudly, rolling her eyes and scoffing under her breath. It didn't take long to realize what her problem was: the armrest. I was using the shared armrest between us. I tried to make myself as small as possible. I pulled my shoulders in, angled my body, did everything I reasonably could in a middle seat. But there's only so much you can do when the plane is packed and you're built the way you're built. That wasn't good enough for her. She suddenly snapped and went on this little rant about how nobody's impressed by muscles, how I take up way too much space, and how no one wants to sit next to meatheads like me. She just kept going. So I interrupted her, very politely, very loudly. I said, "Miss, why don't you simmer down? This is a short flight, and if there's one thing no one wants to deal with, it's a crying child on an airplane." There was a beat of silence. Then the guy in the window seat burst out laughing. So did a couple of people across the aisle who'd clearly been listening the whole time. Her face turned bright red. She didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. She just sat there, stiff and seething, staring straight ahead while everyone else tried not to smile. And honestly, it was the most comfortable part of the trip. And that's today's story. Sometimes it's not about being cruel or clever. Sometimes it's just about being done. Done explaining, done being polite, done protecting someone else's comfort at the cost of your own. If you enjoyed this story, you're definitely in the right place. Subscribe to Reddit Echoes for more real stories, raw moments, and the kind of honesty that leaves people speechless. And if you've ever had a moment where someone pushed you just a little too far, you already know how satisfying it can be when the truth finally comes out. See you in the next one.